There is a city beneath the story of Rome, not buried under it exactly, more like folded into it, absorbed so completely that the seams disappeared and what remained looked like it had always been Roman, had always been exactly what Rome said it was. The people who built that hidden city were not a myth. They were real, with real urban centers, real laws, real religious traditions of extraordinary complexity, and real women who reclined at dinner tables alongside men and drank wine from their own cups, which scandalized Greek writers who described it. They may have helped shape the Roman tradition of gladiatorial combat. They showed an early city on the Tiber how to drain a marsh and build a public space where the marsh had been. They contributed to how that city turned engineering into monumental public architecture. The alphabet you are reading right now passed through their hands before it reached the Romans, and through the Romans to you. And then Rome rose, not killed, not expelled, absorbed, so completely that for centuries their name survived more clearly than their story. The name stayed on the map. The story vanished beneath another civilization's language. This is the history of the Etruscans, a people who were here before Rome, who shaped what Rome became, and who disappeared so thoroughly that most people today could not tell you a single thing about them. The strangest part is not that they vanished. The strangest part is how much of what you think is Roman was theirs first. Start with a ship, somewhere around 700 BC. A vessel, loaded with iron bars, pushed off the coast of a small island in the Tyrrhenian Sea and headed toward the Italian mainland. The island was Elba. The iron it carried was among the finest raw material available in the ancient Western Mediterranean. And the people who controlled that iron, who smelted it, shaped it, and moved it outward into trade networks stretching across the Mediterranean world, were not Romans. Rome did not yet matter. The people who controlled that iron were the Etruscans. Geography is not destiny, but it is opportunity. And the Etruscans were born into one of the most consequential geographic opportunities in the ancient world. Etruria sat near some of the richest metal resources on the Italian peninsula, iron from Elba, close enough to the Tyrrhenian coast that its ore could be ferried across and processed on the mainland, copper from the inland hills of central Etruria, silver, bearing deposits in districts such as Tolfa, a name that means almost nothing to most people today. But that meant everything in a world where silver was money and money was power. In a world where bronze and iron determined who could field an army and sustain long-distance trade. Controlling those resources was not a minor geographic convenience. It was the foundational condition for everything that followed. But geography alone has never built a civilization. Plenty of resource. Rich territories in the ancient world stayed poor and invisible to history. What separated the Etruscans was not what was under the ground. It was what they did with it. They did not simply dig up the metal and sell it raw. They processed it. Archaeologists excavating the ancient site of Populonia on the Tyrrhenian coast with a direct view of Elba across the water found evidence of iron smelting at a scale that speaks of industrial organization rather than casual craft production. Slag heaps accumulated over generations. Furnace remains showing continuous use, the physical signature of a system transforming raw ore into finished goods before channeling them into trade networks reaching across the Mediterranean world. That distinction matters more than it might seem. A territory that exports raw materials is a supplier. A territory that exports finished goods is a manufacturer. Suppliers depend on terms others set. Manufacturers shape demand and control the value added between extraction and sale. The Etruscans were manufacturers in a Mediterranean world that needed what they were making, positioning them not as peripheral contributors to someone else's system, but as a productive center with genuine leverage. Follow that logic forward, and you arrive at how cities actually form. Metal production at industrial scale requires specialized workers whose primary occupation is the furnace and the forge rather than the field. Specialized workers require food they did not grow themselves, which means agricultural surplus has to exist and be directed toward feeding people doing something other than farming. That surplus creates the conditions for further specialization. People who become artists, priests, administrators, merchants, architects. That chain of dependencies is what a city actually is underneath all the columns and the colonnaded streets. It is a system in which enough wealth has accumulated that not everyone has to produce food just to survive. The Etruscans built that system on metal, and on the back of that system, they built cities, genuine urban centers. At a time when most of the Italian peninsula was still organized around scattered villages and small agricultural communities that left almost no permanent trace on the landscape. The placement of those cities tells you something about how the Etruscans understood power. They did not build on flat ground near rivers. The obvious choice for communities primarily concerned with agricultural access, they built on hilltops. Veii, Tarquinia, Cerveteri, Vulci, Populonia, Volterra, all positioned on elevated ground commanding views over river valleys, coastal plains, and the roads connecting them. From those positions, you could see everything moving below. Every caravan, every vessel approaching a harbour. Every loaded wagon on a road-crossing territory you controlled. You could ensure that everything moving through your territory contributed something to the city on the hill that was watching it. That combination, metal wealth, urban organization, and geographic control of movement through the landscape, had few parallels among the pre-Roman peoples of Italy. Other communities had resources. Others had hilltop positions. But the Etruscans assembled those elements into an integrated system, generating the sustained surplus that funds temples, trains artists, and commissions the elaborate painted tombs that scholars are still analyzing today. Etruria also sits at a point where the Italian peninsula narrows, where the Tyrrhenian coast curves in a way that makes it a natural waypoint for maritime traffic moving between the western Mediterranean and the seas south of Italy. Ships moving between Phoenician commercial centres and Greek colonial cities, between North African markets and Adriatic ports, pass through waters that Etruscan cities overlooked. That position gave the Etruscans a front row seat to the commercial traffic of the ancient Mediterranean, and eventually gave their merchants the opportunity to insert themselves into that traffic, not as occasional participants, but as one of its organizing forces. Trade does not only move goods. It moves information. It moves techniques. It moves knowledge of how other people have solved the same problems you are trying to solve. Every Phoenician merchant who came ashore in Etruria brought not only cargo, but a model of how a commercially organized civilization functions. Every Greek vessel entering an Etruscan harbour carried not only wine, but the visual vocabulary of a culture developing sophisticated solutions to urban life and monumental architecture. The Etruscans absorbed all of it, selectively and on their own terms, and turned what they absorbed into something distinctly their own. When Rome eventually expanded northward and began absorbing Etruscan territory city by city, It was not conquering a weakened and primitive people. It was inheriting a functioning system that had been generating surplus, organizing urban life, managing trade, and developing sophisticated cultural and religious traditions for longer than Rome itself had existed as anything a distant observer would have noticed. The roads Roman engineers later improved followed routes the Etruscans had established. The drainage infrastructure associated with early Roman urban development drew on Etruscan engineering traditions. The metalworking, the religious practices, the artistic conventions, the administrative habits that Rome carried forward under its own name. Many of them did not originate in Rome. They originated here, in the hills above the Tyrrhenian coast, in cities whose names most people today struggle to pronounce, built on iron and copper and the organizational intelligence to turn what was underground into what endures above it. They were not a footnote that preceded Roman history. They were one of the foundations on which Roman history was built. And, like most foundations, they were covered over so thoroughly that you would never think to look down. For roughly 2,500 years, serious people have been arguing about where the Etruscans came from. The debate began in antiquity among Greek and Roman writers who had access to traditions that no longer survive. It continued through the Renaissance, when humanist scholars rediscovered the ancient texts and found the question as unresolved as when those texts were written. It consumed genuine academic energy through the 19th and 20th centuries, and it was not substantially resolved until a research team published a genetic study in 2020. 1. Roughly 5 centuries after Herodotus first proposed his answer and set the terms of a debate that would outlast almost every other question in ancient Mediterranean scholarship. The durability of the debate is itself significant. It is not a sign of scholarly failure. It is a sign of how genuinely unusual the Etruscans are, how difficult it has always been to fit them into the standard frameworks that ancient history uses to organize itself. The argument started with Herodotus of Halicarnassus, the Greek historian writing in the 5th century BC. His account of Etruscan origins is one of the most influential wrong answers in the history of ancient scholarship. According to Herodotus, the Etruscans came from Lydia, a kingdom on the western coast of what is now Turkey. He reported that Lydia had suffered a catastrophic famine lasting 18 years, and that the king eventually divided his people into 2 groups, keeping one in Lydia and sending the other westward under the leadership of his son Tyrrhenus. That group sailed to Italy and became the Etruscans, hence the Greek name for them. Tursinoi, or Turhenioi, derived from the legendary prince who led the migration. It is a clean story. It provides a dramatic origin. It explains the name. It accounts for why Etruscan culture seems so different from neighbouring Italian peoples, and it had the authority of Herodotus behind it, whose reputation gave an account a prestige that alternatives struggled to match for centuries. The first serious challenge came from Dionysius of Halicarnassus, a Greek historian living in Rome in the 1st century BC. He had access to sources and direct observations that Herodotus did not. He looked at Etruscan and Lydian and noticed they bore no resemblance to each other. A significant problem for a migration theory built on the idea of a Lydian population becoming Etruscan. He observed that Etruscan religious customs and social practices differed from Lydian ones in ways that a genuine Lydian origin should not have produced. And he argued that the Etruscans were most likely an indigenous Italian people who had always been where they were found, not migrants from the eastern Mediterranean. A third position emerged primarily among modern scholars. This view proposed a northern origin, suggesting that Etruscan ancestors had crossed the Alps from Central Europe during the Late Bronze Age, as part of broader movements of peoples that characterized that period across the continent. Three competing frameworks: Eastern Mediterranean origin, supported by Herodotus; indigenous Italian origin, supported by Dionysius; Northern origin, supported by some patterns in the archaeological record. Scholars debated all three for roughly 2 centuries of modern scholarship without producing consensus, because the available evidence was not precise enough to settle the question definitively. Then came ancient DNA analysis. The study published in Science Advances in 2020. One analysed the ancient genomes of individuals excavated from Etruscan burial sites across the core of Etruria, spanning the height of Etruscan civilization. Picture the researchers in a laboratory, working with bone fragments extracted from tombs that had been sealed for 2,500 years, running the same kind of genomic analysis that has transformed our understanding of prehistoric human migration across the globe. What they were looking for was a genetic signature, a distinctive pattern in the ancient DNA that would connect the Etruscans clearly to Lydia, or to Central Europe, or to the indigenous populations of Italy that had been there since long before any of these theories were proposed. The researchers compared the ancient Etruscan genomes to ancient and modern populations from across Europe, the Mediterranean basin, and the Near East. What the data showed did not support Herodotus. The genetic profiles of the ancient Etruscan individuals showed no evidence of substantial recent migration from Anatolia or the Eastern Mediterranean. The Etruscan samples were genetically similar to other ancient Italian populations from the same period, with a foundation of earlier European ancestry and a layer of steppe-related ancestry consistent with Bronze Age migrations that had spread across Europe generally. In straightforward terms, the Etruscans looked genetically like people who had been living in and around Italy for a long time, not like a distinct population that had arrived recently from Lydia. This does not mean Herodotus fabricated his account. Ancient writers often preserved genuine memories of real population movements, even when specific details had been distorted through generations of retelling. Small groups of Eastern Mediterranean individuals may have arrived in Etruria at various points, contributing cultural elements even if they left no dominant genetic trace. But the core claim of the Herodotian tradition, that the Etruscans as a people originated in Lydia and arrived in Italy as a coherent migrating group, finds no support in the genomic evidence currently available. What the DNA study supports, broadly, is the position closer to Dionysius. The Etruscans were not newcomers from the East. In terms of their biological ancestry, they were a people of Italy, and yet they spoke a language belonging to no large, understood family like Indo-European or Semitic, whose possible distant relatives are too fragmentary to unlock it fully. They organized their society in ways that struck every outside observer as distinctive. They developed religious traditions and artistic conventions that were clearly their own. They were, biologically, a people of Italy who had become, culturally, something that had never quite existed before and would never quite exist again. The lesson embedded in this 2,500-year debate is about the power a well-told story carries over a more accurate but more complicated account. Herodotus gave the Etruscans a founding myth with a famine, a king, A sea voyage. A prince whose name explained the name of the sea. That story dominated the conversation for 25 centuries. The actual story. A people who had been where they were found for a very long time, who developed their singular culture through internal development and selective engagement with the wider Mediterranean world, is less dramatic as a founding narrative, but it is more remarkable as a historical reality. It means the Etruscans did not need to arrive from somewhere prestigious to become what they became. They built everything they built out of the ground they were standing on, the sea in front of them, and whatever they chose to take from the strangers who came to trade. Pick up the liver of Piacenza and look at it carefully. It is a small object, roughly the size of an adult human hand, cast in bronze sometime around the 2nd century BC. Its shape is deliberate and precise, a model of a sheep's liver, because sheep's livers were one of the primary instruments through which Etruscan religious specialists read the divine world. The surface is divided into regions, each one labelled with the name of a deity, each corresponding to a zone of divine concern that a trained reader could locate in the actual organ of a sacrificed animal. We can read every label on that liver. The letters are clearly incised and well preserved. The script is fully legible. We can pronounce the words on its surface with reasonable confidence. What we cannot do is tell you exactly what every element of the system meant. Not because the object is damaged, not because the letters are ambiguous, but because the language those labels are written in. Etruscan is one of the most genuinely isolated languages in the history of ancient scholarship. And despite more than a century of concentrated academic effort, it still holds dimensions of meaning that no living person can recover with complete confidence. That situation is strange enough on its own. It becomes remarkable when you learn how much Etruscan text actually survives. Most ancient languages that scholars struggle to interpret exist in tantalizing fragments. A handful of inscriptions, a few damaged tablets, enough to confirm the language existed, but not enough to reconstruct how it worked. Etruscan presents the opposite problem. Somewhere between 12,000 and 13,000 Etruscan inscriptions have been identified and catalogued. By the standards of ancient languages at a comparable stage of interpretation, that is a substantial corpus. More Etruscan survives in written form than many people would expect, and considerably more than survives of languages that are far better understood. The problem lies in what those texts contain. The overwhelming majority of Etruscan inscriptions are funerary. They record names, they identify family relationships, they say, in their essential content. Something like this belongs to a specific person, or this is the resting place of someone whose parentage is then recorded. They are, in effect, ancient gravestones, useful for understanding naming conventions and family structures, but not the kind of texts that reveal how a civilization thought about the world, what it believed about the gods, how it organized its laws, or what stories it told its children. The longer texts that do exist. Ritual calendars, administrative records, and most remarkably, a lengthy religious text now called the Liber Linteus, the Linen Book, which survived only because it was cut into strips and used to wrap an Egyptian mummy that ended up in a museum in Zagreb. Give researchers more to work with, but they remain limited in number. And the specialized vocabulary of ritual language creates its own interpretive challenges. Since such texts assume a background of shared knowledge that no longer exists to be consulted, what makes Etruscan uniquely difficult is not primarily the scarcity of complex texts, It is the language's complete absence of recognized family connections to better understood ancient languages. Every major language of ancient Italy and the Mediterranean belongs to an identifiable family. Latin is Indo. European. Greek is Indo. European. The ancient Semitic languages of the Near East are related to one another in ways that linguists can trace with precision and use as tools for interpreting less documented members of the family. When scholars encounter an unknown ancient language showing clear family resemblances to known languages, they have powerful analytical tools. Etruscan does not belong to any large, understood family like Indo, European or Semitic. Its possible distant relatives are too limited to unlock it fully, even if the family connection is accepted, which itself remains a matter of scholarly discussion. Etruscan stands essentially alone in the ancient linguistic landscape. Scholars have recovered significant information about Etruscan through other means. The repetition of formulaic phrases in funerary inscriptions has allowed basic grammar to be mapped with reasonable confidence. Bilingual inscriptions pairing Etruscan with Latin or Greek provide vocabulary anchor points. The names of deities and mythological figures can be cross-referenced with archaeological and artistic sources. A core vocabulary has been established. Scholars working today can extract meaningful information from an Etruscan text with genuine confidence in many cases. But the depth of comprehension available for Latin or Greek, the ability to read a text and understand not just its words, but the full world of assumptions and references behind it, that depth is simply not achievable for Etruscan with current evidence, and here is the detail most accounts pass over too quickly. The isolation of Etruscan is almost certainly the primary reason Etruscan literature did not survive. Latin survived because Rome survived, and because institutions committed to Latin's preservation survived Rome itself. The Catholic Church maintained Latin through the medieval period. Monasteries copied Latin manuscripts across more than 1,000 years. Scholars taught Latin continuously from antiquity into the modern era. The survival of Latin literature is the predictable outcome of a language that remained institutionally important for an extraordinarily long time. Greek survived through the continuous existence of Byzantine civilization, which maintained Greek as the language of governance and scholarship for nearly 1,000 years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Etruscan had no such institutional continuation. When the Etruscan cities were absorbed into the Roman administrative system, the social and political structures that might have sustained Etruscan as a living literary language were dismantled. There was no Etruscan church to preserve Etruscan manuscripts. There was no Etruscan successor state to maintain the language as a language of prestige. What remains is the residue of a civilization's written life rather than its substance. The gravestones, the votive inscriptions, the labels on the bronze liver, the linen book found inside a mummy, 12,000 to 13,000 texts that tell researchers a great deal about certain things and almost nothing about others. The Etruscans almost certainly told stories about their history and their gods. They had a theology complex enough to require extensive written materials. Whatever they wrote about those things is gone. Not because they failed to write it, but because the institutional chain that would have preserved it was broken when the civilization sustaining it was absorbed into one, with no incentive to maintain what it was replacing. The liver of Piacenza is still in a museum in the Italian city of Piacenza. Its labels are still legible. Every word on it can be read by anyone who learns the Etruscan alphabet. The reading takes seconds. We can decode the surface. We cannot recover the depth behind it. And that gap between decoding and understanding is where the Etruscans still live, patient and unresolved, in possession of something we may never fully reclaim. Every civilization wants a clean origin story, a founding moment, a legendary ancestor, a divine act separating the time before from the time after. Rome had Romulus. Greece had the Olympians. Egypt had divine pharaohs ruling a civilization that presented itself as having always existed in its current form. The Etruscans do not give you that kind of story. And the reason is not a gap in the historical record. It is because the Etruscans, like all actual civilizations, did not begin at a specific moment. They accumulated, they thickened, they became, gradually and unevenly, through processes invisible to the people living through them, the thing we look back at from 2,500 years away and call Etruscan civilization. To follow that process honestly, you have to begin with something almost no one outside archaeology has heard of. A cultural tradition occupying the same landscape as the Etruscans before the Etruscans became identifiable as such. And that became the Etruscans through a transformation so gradual. The archaeological record contains no clear line marking, where one ended and the other began. That tradition is called Villanovan, named after a site near Bologna, where its characteristic remains were first systematically identified in the 19th century. Villanovan communities occupied roughly the same territory that would later be known as Etruria, from the Arno River in the north to the Tiber in the south, from the Apennine Hills to the Tyrrhenian coast. They were present in that landscape from roughly 900 BC onward, and they shared practices that would become recognizable, in modified and elaborated forms, as features of Etruscan civilization. They cremated their dead and placed the ashes in ceramic urns of distinctive forms, some shaped like the huts of the living, a practice speaking of belief in some kind of continuity between the world of the living and the dead. They buried those urns in cemetery areas outside their settlements, creating organized spaces for the dead, reflecting organized thinking about the community that had preceded the living. They worked metal with skill and aesthetic ambition well beyond basic utility, producing bronze objects decorated with geometric patterns of genuine complexity. The long scholarly debate about whether Villanovan culture was the direct ancestor of Etruscan civilization or a separate phenomenon has been largely resolved in favor of continuity. The Villanovan communities were not a different people who disappeared when the Etruscans arrived. They were the people who became the Etruscans. The transformation between the two is a process, not an event, driven not by a new population arriving and displacing an existing one, but by an existing population changing in response to new conditions and new contacts. The question that actually matters is not when did the Etruscans arrive, because they did not arrive. They were already there. The question is what changed, and when, and why. That transformed a sophisticated Bronze Age culture into the civilization we recognize as Etruscan. The answer is sitting in the archaeological layers of sites across Etruria, sometime around 800 to 750 BC. Something new starts appearing in the material record of the communities that would become Etruscan. Greek pottery, not made locally but genuinely imported, begins showing up in burial contexts at sites across the future Etruscan heartland. Slightly later, objects of Phoenician origin appear as well. Decorated ostrich eggs, small carved objects in styles connecting to the Eastern Mediterranean, items that could only have arrived through contact with people who had access to the wider Mediterranean network. These objects are evidence of connection, and connection in the ancient Mediterranean carried consequences far beyond the exchange of goods. A Phoenician merchant coming ashore on the Tyrrhenian coast in the 8th century BC brought not only cargo but familiarity with alphabetic writing that the Phoenicians were spreading across the Mediterranean. The Greeks, arriving on the same shores, brought visual language and narrative tradition encoded in the pottery they traded. The figures painted on Greek vessels showed gods, heroes, athletes, and scenes of war and celebration, representing a complete way of seeing and organizing human experience through image and story. Any community acquiring and using Greek pottery was simultaneously absorbing the visual language of Greek civilization. The Phoenicians contributed the practical infrastructure of commercial civilization and the technology of alphabetic writing. The Greeks contributed visual language and models of urban, religious, and political organization. Together, arriving through the medium of trade rather than conquest or migration. They provided the Villanovan communities of central Italy with raw materials for a transformation, but the Etruscans did not become Phoenician. They did not become Greek. What they did with the materials they received was something more interesting and more demanding than simple adoption. They filtered, they selected. They combined what arrived from outside with what they already had from inside. Their metalworking traditions, their burial practices, their specific relationship to the landscape they had occupied for generations, and produced from that combination something genuinely new. The Etruscan alphabet illustrates the process clearly. The Etruscans received the Greek alphabet, itself adapted from Phoenician, and adapted it again for their own language. The earliest Etruscan alphabetic inscriptions date to the late 8th century BC and appear at multiple sites across the region, suggesting rapid adoption once the model was available. But they did not simply copy Greek letters. They modified the forms, adjusted the phonetic values to match the sounds of Etruscan, and developed a script recognizably derived from Greek while being distinctly their own. The same process appears across the full range of Etruscan cultural production in the period between roughly 750 and 600 BC. Etruscan craftsmen learned from Phoenician metalworking and pushed those techniques in new directions. Etruscan painters learned from Greek pottery decoration and developed their own visual traditions. Etruscan religious specialists encountered ideas from multiple Mediterranean sources and assembled from those encounters the systematic body of practice that would become the Etrusca disciplina, which had no direct parallel anywhere in the ancient world. The transformation took roughly a century and a half, from the first clear signs of Mediterranean contact around 750 BC to the period around 600 BC, when Etruscan civilization is fully recognizable as a distinct and sophisticated entity in the archaeological record. A merchant stepped off a ship onto the Tyrrhenian shore carrying letters and wine and stories from the wider world. The people on the shore did not become him. They took what he brought, combined it with everything they already were, and became something the ancient Mediterranean had never seen before. That is how civilizations actually form, not in founding moments that can be pointed to and dated, but in accumulations of small encounters and adaptations that individually seem unremarkable and collectively produce something that could not have been predicted from any single one of them. Draw a map of Etruria at the height of its power, somewhere around the 6th century BC. And what you see is not an empire. There is no capital city at the center with administrative lines radiating outward to subject territories. There is no single palace from which a king sends orders to governors, enforcing them across a unified domain. There is no army in unified chain of command. No treasury collecting taxes from a conquered periphery. No bureaucratic apparatus connecting the parts into a coherent whole under one supreme authority. What you see instead is a collection of cities. Independent cities. Cities that shared a language. A religion. A set of cultural practices. And a recognizable common identity. But that governed themselves separately. Made their own decisions about war and peace. Controlled their own trade relationships, and answered to no central authority with power to compel them. The Greeks called this arrangement the dodecapoli, meaning the 12 cities, though the number was probably more conventional than precise, a way of naming the major Etruscan centres rather than a literal fixed count. The cities most frequently named include Veii, Tarquinia, Cerveteri, Vulci, Populonia, Vetulonia, Rucellae, Volsini, Cumae, Perugia, Cortona, and Arretium. The specific list varies between sources and across different periods, reflecting the fact that the relative importance of individual cities shifted as some grew and others declined. Each of these cities was its own political world. Many ancient traditions remembered Etruscan leaders as lucumones, a term describing figures combining political authority with religious functions. Though how consistently that role was organized across different cities and periods remains a matter of scholarly discussion rather than settled fact. Each city maintained its own aristocratic families, its own patronage networks, its own decisions about which alliances to pursue and which threats to resist. The one institutional context in which the major Etruscan cities regularly came together was the annual gathering at a sanctuary called the Fanum Voltumnae, somewhere in the territory of Volsinii in central Etruria. The gathering had a primarily religious character, organized around shared rituals honoring the major Etruscan deities. But it was also the closest thing Etruscan civilization had to a common political forum, a space where the leaders of the cities could meet and discuss matters of shared concern. What the Fanum Voltumnae gathering could not do was make binding decisions for the cities that attended it. There was no mechanism through which the gathering could compel a member city to take a specific military action, contribute forces to a shared army, or accept a collective decision conflicting with its own perceived interests. Each city remained sovereign. The gathering was a space for ceremony and conversation, not a governing body capable of directing collective behavior. Whatever combination of factors produced this arrangement, geographic conditions, the specific character of Etruscan aristocratic culture, the religious traditions giving each city its own distinct ritual identity. The result was that the Etruscans never built the kind of centralized political machine that Rome would become. That absence was not a temporary condition waiting to be corrected. It was a stable feature of Etruscan political organization that persisted across the entire span of Etruscan civilization. The comparison with the Greek world is instructive and worth handling carefully. Classical Greece was also organized around independent states that resisted political unification with a tenacity that sometimes reached into genuine self-destruction. But when the Persian Empire invaded Greece, some Greek cities managed to construct a military alliance capable of mounting an effective defense. The alliance was fragile and dissolved quickly once the immediate threat receded. But it existed, and it was sufficient to prevent Persian conquest at its critical moments. The Etruscan cities never achieved equivalent coordination, even when their collective survival demanded it. When Rome began its systematic campaign of absorption across the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, advancing city by city through Etruria with patience and organizational consistency. The Etruscan political structure produced no collective military response. Veii fought alone and fell after 10 years of siege. Tarquinia conducted its own negotiations and its own resistance. Cerveteri pursued a separate accommodation, with Rome reflecting its own particular situation. Vulci held out longest, but without meaningful support from cities already absorbed. Rome was able to treat each Etruscan city as a separate military problem, concentrating its resources against one, while the others watched and calculated their individual positions. That is what a centralized military system can do against a distributed one. It chooses the time and place of each engagement, and it wins them one at a time. It would be too simple and too condescending to read this as a failure of Etruscan political intelligence. The people who built Veii and Tarquinia and Cerveteri understood power and strategic competition with considerable sophistication. The political structure they maintained was not an oversight or an accident. It reflected genuine values about the proper relationship between individual cities and collective authority. And it had served the Etruscan cities well across the period of their greatest prosperity. The Etruscans valued the completeness and sovereignty of their individual cities in a way that was fundamental to their political identity. Each city was a full world, with its own religious traditions, its own aristocratic families, its own commercial networks. Subordinating that completeness to a central authority would have meant, from the perspective of people living within each city, a loss of something essential to what the city was and what it meant to belong to it. That is a coherent political philosophy. It produced genuine cultural flourishing. The independent cities of Etruria developed distinctive local artistic traditions, religious practices, and architectural styles that gave the Etruscan world its remarkable internal variety. The tomb paintings of Tarquinia are not identical to those of Cerveteri. The bronze traditions of Vulci differ from those of Chiusi. The diversity within Etruscan civilization is, in part, a product of the decentralized structure that allowed each city to develop along its own trajectory. But that same structure could not concentrate force against an opponent that had made the opposite choice. Centralized power can direct resources in ways distributed power cannot match. Rome understood this. Rome was built on this understanding, and the results played out across 2 centuries of sequential Etruscan defeats. The Etruscan cities, individually, were formidable opponents. Veii held out against Rome for 10 years before falling. That is a remarkable performance by any historical standard. They were just impossible to unite. Rome looked at the Etruscan world and saw a collection of separate targets that could be addressed one at a time. The Etruscans looked at Rome and saw a neighbour whose power was growing but whose intentions could still be managed through individual negotiation and accommodation. By the time they understood what Rome actually was, the first of their cities had already fallen, and there was no one with the authority to tell the rest of them what to do about it. Follow a single object. It leaves a workshop somewhere in the Etruscan city of Cerveteri, or perhaps Vulci, sometime in the 7th century BC. It is a vessel made of ceramic, fired under specific conditions that remove oxygen from the kiln and turn the clay a deep, consistent black, not painted black. The blackness goes all the way through the material, produced by a reduction process that Etruscan potters developed and refined over generations into a technique of considerable technical sophistication. The surface has a faint metallic sheen. The walls are thin. The decoration is restrained. incised geometric forms that let the quality of the material speak. This vessel, a piece of what archaeologists call bucchero ware, will travel, not immediately, not directly, but through a series of transactions that will carry it from the workshop to a destination the potter who shaped it could not have imagined. Pieces of bucchero have been recovered from archaeological contexts in what is now Spain, in what is now France, along the North African coast, at sites in what is now Syria. They appear in quantities, indicating systematic distribution through organized trade networks operating across much of the ancient Mediterranean world. That piece of pottery is a record, fired into clay and preserved in the ground for 500 years, of what the Etruscans built between roughly 700 and 500 BC. The commercial network the Etruscans developed in this period was not an empire in any political sense. There were no Etruscan governors in foreign cities, no Etruscan garrisons holding distant territories in submission. What the Etruscans built was a network of commercial relationships, harbour rights, merchant contacts, trusted intermediaries, and distribution channels moving goods across thousands of kilometres of sea and land routes without requiring military force to sustain it. The foundation of that network was the metal wealth that had made Etruscan urban civilization possible in the first place. Iron from Elba, copper from the inland hills of Etruria, finished metalwork of consistently high quality produced in workshops with generations of accumulated technical knowledge. These were what the Etruscans carried outward into Mediterranean markets. And in those markets, Etruscan metal goods commanded prices that reflected both their material quality and the reputation for craftsmanship that Etruscan producers had built across 2 centuries of active commercial engagement. But the network required more than good products. It required reliable access to the routes along which those products travelled. And on the Tyrrhenian Sea, the primary commercial highway connecting the Italian peninsula to the broader western Mediterranean world, the Etruscans exercised a degree of influence during the 6th and 7th centuries BC that their contemporaries could not ignore. That influence was not maintained primarily through military force. The Etruscans did maintain warships and could project naval power when they chose to. But the day instrument of their maritime position was commercial rather than military. Control of harbours along the Tyrrhenian coast, relationships with island communities, networks of agents positioned at key nodes of the trade routes. These were the mechanisms through which Etruscan merchants shaped the flow of goods through western Mediterranean waters. The alliance with Carthage that appears in ancient sources during the 6th century BC was a natural product of overlapping commercial interests. Carthage, the great Phoenician colonial city on the North African coast, was the dominant commercial presence in the western Mediterranean, south and west of the Tyrrhenian. Etruria was the dominant commercial presence in the Tyrrhenian itself. Their shared interest in limiting Greek commercial expansion into zones they already organized gave them a basis for cooperation that ancient sources describe as extending to formal treaty arrangements. The city of Spina, positioned near the mouth of the Po River on the Adriatic coast, illustrates the geographic reach and organizational sophistication of the Etruscan commercial world at its most developed. Spina was an Etruscan commercial foundation, established in the 6th century BC to serve as the Adriatic gateway for Etruscan trade, moving northward toward the Alpine passes and Central Europe. The archaeological excavation of the necropolis associated with Spina produced one of the largest collections of Athenian painted pottery found anywhere outside Greece itself. Thousands of Athenian vessels, the finest pottery being made anywhere in the ancient world during the 5th and 4th centuries BC, appeared in the tombs of Spina's merchant community. Think carefully about what that distribution chain required. Someone in Spina had to maintain ongoing commercial relationships with suppliers in the Athenian world. Someone had to organize transport of fragile ceramic goods across the Adriatic and up through the Po Valley without losing enough product to make the enterprise unprofitable. Someone had to manage relationships with Celtic communities of the interior who were the end consumers, understanding what they valued and how to reach them reliably. The Etruscan merchants doing all of this were sophisticated commercial operators, and the civilization that produced them was wealthy and complex enough to give them the capital and institutional support they needed to operate at that scale. The wealth that network generated found its most visible expression in the cities of Etruria. The painted tombs, the bronze and gold objects, the elaborate civic spaces, all speak of communities with access to substantial resources and the artistic sophistication to translate those resources into things of enduring beauty. The feasts depicted in the early tomb paintings of Tarquinia were not fantasies. They were representations of what the commercial wealth of Etruscan cities had actually made possible. The wine, the bronze vessels, the musicians. All of it funded by the network that moved bucero from Etruscan workshops to tables across the Mediterranean world. That entire world rested on the ability to move goods through Western Mediterranean waters on terms the Etruscans helped to set. When that ability began to erode, everything built on it began to shift. The network was the foundation. Everything else was what the foundation supported. The piece of bucero that travelled from a kiln in Etruria to a table in Syria or Spain and eventually into the earth of an archaeological site is a message preserved in fired clay across 25 centuries. They reached further than history remembered. They helped organise important parts of the commercial world of the Western Mediterranean in ways that shaped everything that came after them, including the civilization that eventually replaced them. In the summer of around 520 BC, a painter descended into a chamber cut from the volcanic tufa beneath the necropolis of Tarquinia and began covering its walls with images that would survive, sealed in darkness, for 2,500 years. The chamber is known today as the Tomb of the Lionesses. The paintings on its walls are among the most discussed pieces of ancient art in existence. Not because they represent the most technically complex painting from the ancient world, and not because they depict scenes of mythological grandeur or military triumph, the expected subjects of prestige art in most ancient cultures. They are discussed because of what they show and because of what the showing of it meant. On the back wall, beneath the two feline figures that give the tomb its modern name, a celebration is underway. An aristocratic woman reclines on a cushioned surface, holding a cup. She is not holding it to offer to someone else. She is holding it to drink from herself. Her position in the room is not defined by service or subordination. It is defined by participation, the same participation the men around her claim, in the same physical posture, with the same apparent right to be present and take pleasure in the occasion. Around this central scene, musicians play and dancers move, with an energy and an unself-consciousness that painted figures of almost every other ancient culture do not convey. The colours are still vivid, red and yellow and black against the pale plaster surface, and they create an immediate sensory impression that 500 years of intervening darkness have not entirely extinguished. The aristocratic woman with the cup was not an unusual image in Etruscan visual culture. Versions of her appear across dozens of tomb paintings, on bronze mirrors, on decorated pottery found in domestic contexts. Women of the Etruscan aristocratic class participating in public celebration, in shared social ritual, in the activities that defined aristocratic life in the Etruscan cities, were a routine subject of Etruscan visual representation. What was routine in Etruria was, by the standards of every other civilization in the ancient Mediterranean world at the same period, remarkable. Greek aristocratic women of the classical period did not attend the symposium, the formal communal drinking occasion that was one of the primary institutions of Greek male social life. That space was exclusively male. Women of respectable status in classical Athens were expected to remain within the domestic interior of the household, appearing in public in limited and tightly controlled circumstances. The idea of a respectable Athenian woman reclining at a drinking party beside men who were not her immediate male relatives, holding her own cup, occupying the same social space on equivalent terms, was not merely unconventional, it was a category violation. When Greek writers encountered Etruscan social practices, they responded with a combination of ethnographic curiosity and barely contained disapproval. Theopompus of Chios, a Greek historian of the 4th century BC, produced an account of Etruscan women that has been cited for centuries as evidence of Etruscan licentiousness. He described women who exercised alongside men, who attended dinner in mixed company, who drank freely and conducted themselves with a social freedom he found deeply incompatible with proper civilization. What Theopompus was actually describing, stripped of the moral framework he was projecting onto it, was a society organized around different assumptions about the proper role of aristocratic women in social life. His account is valuable precisely as a record of those assumptions colliding. The behavior that seemed to him to indicate disorder was, within the Etruscan social framework, simply the normal behavior of women of a certain class. The archaeological evidence goes well beyond the tomb paintings. The funerary inscriptions constituting the largest surviving body of Etruscan text reveal a naming practice with no parallel in the contemporary Mediterranean world. Etruscan individuals were identified in formal contexts by both their father's family name and their mother's family name. A dual lineage system giving maternal descent formal recognition in the official record of a person's identity. In the Greek world, a person was identified by their own name followed by their father's name, with no acknowledgement of maternal lineage. In the Roman world, the naming system was similarly patrilineal. The Etruscan practice of recording both parental lineages in formal contexts indicates genuine institutional recognition of female lineage that surrounding cultures did not share. The sarcophagus of the spouses, found at Cerveteri and now divided between museums in Rome and Paris, is perhaps the most iconic single piece of evidence for the character of Etruscan aristocratic social life. It shows a husband and wife reclining together, her arm around his shoulder, both present in the scene with equal visual weight and equal apparent ease. There is no hierarchy of placement or posture in the composition. There is no gesture of service or subordination. There are two people, together, depicted as two people who have lived their lives in each other's company. It is worth noting that what the evidence shows most clearly applies to aristocratic women in the major Etruscan cities during the period of greatest flourishing. Women of lower social classes, women in different regional contexts, women of later periods when Etruscan society was under increasing Roman pressure. may have experienced very different realities that the surviving evidence does not allow us to reconstruct. But what the evidence does show, with genuine consistency across multiple types of sources, is that for the women who appear in it, Etruscan aristocratic civilization offered a form of social participation and institutional recognition that made it distinctive among the ancient Mediterranean cultures that have left comparable records. The painter who descended into the tomb of the lionesses around 520 BC was not making an argument or recording an aberration. He was painting what he saw, which is to say, what his culture considered normal for aristocratic women of his time and place. And what his culture considered normal was women present in the spaces where social life happened, holding their own cups, occupying their own positions, visible in their own right. That normalcy is, across 500 years of distance, one of the most striking things about the Etruscan world. Walk into the tomb of the leopards in Tarquinia. You are underground now, in a chamber cut from the soft volcanic tufa that underlies the ancient necropolis. The ceiling is low, the space is intimate, and covering every surface of the walls are images that have survived in sealed darkness for 500 years. On the back wall, two leopards face each other across a scene of extraordinary vitality. A bonker is in progress. Men and women recline on cushioned surfaces in the postures of people at ease with each other and with the occasion. They hold cups. They gesture in conversation. Musicians play beside them. The colours are red and black and yellow against the pale plaster ground, still vivid enough to register as vivid rather than simply as ancient. Everything in the scene projects an ease with being alive that ancient art almost never captures so directly. Now walk into a different tomb, the tomb of Orcus, also in Tarquinia, painted roughly 2 centuries later. The transformation is immediate and total. The warm palette is gone. The feasting figures are gone. The musicians are gone. What occupies the walls instead is an underworld. And it is not a comfortable one. Charu, the Etruscan figure associated with the transition between the living world and the dead one, appears not with a ferryman's oar, but with a hammer. His skin, a deep blue. His features combining human and animal in a way that registers as genuinely threatening. Tuchulcha, another underworld figure, has a vulture's beak and serpents rising from its head. The dead move through this landscape with expressions that are not peaceful. They are people who have arrived somewhere they did not choose to go and cannot leave. Something happened between those two tombs. Something that changed the way an entire civilization imagined what waited on the other side of death. The necropolis of Tarquinia, the city of the dead spread across the plateau of Monterozzi, outside the modern town, contains roughly 6,000 burial mounds. Approximately 200 of those tombs preserve painted chambers in condition clear enough for meaningful analysis. That collection is one of the most significant archives of ancient art in existence. Not only for its aesthetic quality, but for what it records about how Etruscan civilization understood its relationship with death across roughly 4 centuries. When those painted chambers are arranged in chronological sequence and studied as a progression, a pattern emerges that invites questions beyond purely internal artistic development. The early tombs, from roughly 600 to 450 BC, are dominated by images of pleasure and vitality, feasting, music, dancing, athletic competition, scenes of hunting and fishing, animals and birds rendered with genuine attentiveness to how living things move. The tomb of hunting and fishing, from around 520 BC, covers its walls with a natural world in motion. Birds above the water, fish below the surface, hunters on the shore. Everything caught at a moment of energy and life. The emotional register of these early tombs is consistently forward. Looking, death is not denied in a burial chamber, but the imagery suggests a relationship with death in which what matters most is the continuation of everything that made life worth living. Then something shifts. In the course of the 5th century BC, the register begins to change. Underworld figures appear at the margins of scenes that remain predominantly joyful. By the 4th century BC and into the 3rd, the transformation is substantially complete. The feasting couples have been displaced by underworld processions. The musicians have been replaced by charu and tukulcha. The colours have darkened. The emotional register has moved from ease to apprehension. The 4th century BC is precisely the period in which Roman pressure on the Etruscan cities begins to intensify in ways the cities cannot collectively answer. In 396 BC, Veii falls after 10 years of Roman siege. Roman campaigns into Etruscan territory become more frequent and more penetrating through the course of the century. The Gallic migrations have already cost the Etruscans their northern extension in the Po Valley. The commercial dominance of the Tyrrhenian was lost at Cumae in 470. 4 BC. The Etruscan world is contracting from multiple directions simultaneously during exactly the period when the painters of Tarquinia are filling their burial chambers with blue-skinned demons and anxious processions of the newly dead. Establishing direct causation between these two developments is not something the evidence allows. No Etruscan painter left a written account explaining why they chose the images they chose. The shift in Etruscan funerary art reflects multiple factors: evolving theology, increasing influence from Greek underworld traditions, changing conventions of aristocratic self-presentation that cannot be isolated from each other or from external political pressure with the precision that causation requires. But the timing is there, and it raises a question worth holding. When a civilization starts losing the world it built, does it begin? In the imagery it creates for its most intimate ritual purposes, to show what that losing feels like. The evidence from Tarquinia does not answer that question conclusively, but it does not allow us to ignore it either. The tomb of the leopards and the tomb of Orcus are separated by roughly 2 centuries and perhaps 200 meters of plateau. They are products of the same craft tradition, painted for families who understood themselves as members of the same civilization, but they do not feel like they belong to the same world. The world of the tomb of the leopards believed in its own future. The world of the tomb of Orcus had started to wonder whether it had one. Imagine the night before a decision that cannot be delayed. The city has to choose. A military threat is approaching, or a treaty offer has arrived with a deadline, or a succession question has become urgent and the competing factions cannot agree. The men with the most political power are in the room, and they disagree. And no amount of additional discussion is going to produce a consensus that everyone present can accept. In an Etruscan city of the 6th or 5th century BC, what happens next is not what would happen in a modern government, or in a Greek city, state relying on debate and vote, or in a Roman Senate, relying on institutional precedent. What happens next is that someone calls for the haruspex. The haruspex was one of the most important figures in Etruscan public life, and in the 2,000 years since Etruscan civilization was absorbed into Rome, one of the most consistently misunderstood. The word itself passed into Latin, and through Latin, into European scholarship, carrying connotations of the primitive, the superstitious, the categorically rational. The image of a man reading the entrails of a sacrificed animal to determine the will of the gods has served as a convenient emblem of everything that made ancient religion different from what came after it. That image is not inaccurate as a description of what a haruspex did. The misunderstanding lies in what it is taken to mean about the intelligence and the purpose behind the practice. The Etrusca disciplina was the name for the comprehensive body of knowledge that organized Etruscan religious and ritual practice. It was not a single document, but a tradition organized into several distinct branches, each addressing a different domain through which, in the Etruscan theological framework, the divine world communicated with the human one. The Libri Haruspicini governed the interpretation of animal entrails, with the liver as the primary organ of interest, understood as the seat of life, and the organ most directly receptive to divine presence in a living creature. The examination was not a general inspection followed by intuitive interpretation. It was a structured analysis conducted according to a specific topographic system in which different regions of the organ corresponded to different deities and different domains of divine concern. The bronze liver of Piacenza is the most complete surviving evidence of this system. A training model mapping the divine geography onto the surface of the organ, allowing the student to learn where to look and what it means when something is found there. The Libri Fulgurales governed the interpretation of lightning. In the Etruscan system, thunder and lightning were communications from specific deities, and the information they carried depended on the direction from which the lightning came, the time of day or night, whether it struck a public or private space, whether it left a visible mark. Specialists trained in this branch extracted specific information from a lightning event that an untrained observer would experience as simply a storm. The Libri Rituales addressed the ceremonial dimensions of Etruscan collective life, the proper procedures for founding a city, for declaring war, for concluding peace, for burying the dead in ways satisfying the obligations the living owed, the departed, and the divine powers governing the transition between states. Now step back from the specific content and think about the problem these practices were designed to address. A community in the ancient world faced consequential decisions under conditions of genuine uncertainty on a regular basis. Should we commit our military resources to this campaign now, or wait? Should we accept this alliance on these terms, or hold out? Is this political arrangement stable enough to build on? These questions are not easy in any era. Modern governments, with access to military intelligence, economic modelling, and historical analysis, still get them wrong with considerable frequency. In a world without any of those tools, how do you make consequential decisions under conditions of radical uncertainty? One approach is to leave the decision to whoever has the most political power in the room, which tends to produce answers shaped by personal interest and factional calculation. Another approach is to develop a structured process for channeling the uncertainty into a form that can be consistently managed, that produces a specific answer rather than an irresolvable argument, and that carries enough shared authority to be accepted by all parties as legitimate, even when the outcome is not what any of them would have chosen independently. The Etrusca disciplina was the second approach. It was not science in any modern sense, but it was a disciplined ritual system for making decisions when evidence was insufficient, applied by specialists with specific training, according to rules that all parties had agreed in advance to accept. It was an institutional mechanism for taking the decision out of the purely political domain and placing it in a domain governed by shared procedural norms that no single faction could unilaterally override. That function is not trivial. It is, in fact, one of the central problems any system of governance has to solve. How do you make decisions under uncertainty in a way the community will accept as legitimate? Modern democracies solve it with elections and courts and legislatures. Ancient polities solved it with various combinations of deliberation, popular assembly, and religious ceremonial, serving some of the same functions through different institutional forms. The Etruscan solution was the disciplina, and it worked well enough that when Rome absorbed the Etruscan cities, Roman elites continued to rely on Etruscan, trained haruspices for matters of public significance. The Roman Senate consulted haruspices throughout the period of the Republic and into the imperial era. When a man named Spurina warned Julius Caesar to beware the Ides of March, the tradition he was working in was Etruscan in its origins and had been part of Roman public life for centuries. Roman aristocrats were often pragmatic about what they absorbed from the peoples they incorporated into their world. They kept what served useful functions and discarded what did not. They kept haruspici for the same reason they kept Etruscan engineering traditions and Etruscan urban planning conventions. Not out of sentiment, but because it served a real function that nothing in the Roman institutional tradition had developed to replace. The haruspect sitting in the Etruscan council chamber the night before the decision that could not be delayed was not a primitive practitioner of irrational magic. He was a specialist applying a structured body of knowledge to a specific institutional problem, in a framework that all parties in the room had accepted as the legitimate process for reaching a conclusion they could all act on. Whether the divine communication he believed he was reading was actually present in the organ he examined is a question that lies outside the domain of historical analysis. What historical analysis can say is that the system functioned, that it served real purposes, and that the civilization which developed it was sophisticated enough to sustain and transmit it across centuries until a more powerful civilization arrived and, finding it useful, absorbed it along with everything else. That should tell you something about what the Etrusca disciplina actually was. There is a version of early Roman history that most people absorb without ever being told it directly. Rome was founded by Romulus. It was governed by 7 kings before the Romans expelled the last of them and established the Republic. The kings were Latin or Sabine in character, representing the indigenous peoples of the central Italian peninsula. They were followed by the great institutions of Roman republican governance: the Senate, the consuls, the assemblies, the legal framework that made Rome, Rome. The line runs from Romulus through the Republic, to the Empire, to the civilization that shaped the Western world. What that version leaves out is significant enough to change the meaning of almost everything else in the story. 3 of the 7 kings in the Roman tradition were either Etruscan in origin or so deeply embedded in Etruscan cultural frameworks that the distinction between an Etruscan king and a Roman king shaped by Etruria becomes difficult to maintain under examination. Their names in the tradition are Tarquinius Priscus, who ruled as the 5th king, Servius Tullius, who ruled as the 6th, and Tarquinius Superbus, the Proud, who ruled as the 7th and last before the Republic began. Under these 3 rulers, Rome was transformed from a moderately significant settlement on the Tiber into something that looks, in its physical infrastructure and its institutional organization, like the foundation of what Rome would eventually become. Start with a single craftsman. Ancient writers name him He was called Vulci of Veii, and according to the ancient sources, he was the sculptor responsible for the terracotta decorations of the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, the most sacred space in Roman public religion throughout the Republic and the early Empire. Vulci is one of the very few named artists from the early Roman period whose name the ancient sources preserved, which speaks to how significant the Etruscan artistic contribution to Rome's most important religious building was understood to be even centuries later. Picture him descending from a scaffold on the Capitoline Hill sometime in the late 6th century BC. Looking back at the terracotta figures he has been shaping for months, knowing that when he returns to his home in Veii, roughly 15 kilometers to the north, he will leave behind something that Romans will worship in for generations. He was not a Roman. He was brought south specifically for skills developed in a tradition of Etruscan religious architecture. What he left behind on the Capitoline Hill became, in Roman memory, simply Roman, and the city he returned to became, within a century, a city that Rome would besiege and destroy. That is the story of the Etruscan contribution to early Rome in miniature. The craftsman came, built something essential, went home, and the thing he built was absorbed so thoroughly into Roman identity that its origins became invisible. Tarquinius Priscus arrived in Rome, according to the Roman tradition, from the Etruscan city of Tarquinia. He did not arrive carrying only personal qualities. He arrived as someone formed by a cultural tradition that was considerably more organizationally sophisticated than what Rome had developed on its own at that point. The knowledge of how to organize a city of a certain scale, how to manage the religious institutions, giving collective life its legitimacy, how to build the physical infrastructure, making urban density viable. These came in significant part from a civilization that had been developing and refining them for 2 centuries before Rome was significant enough to attract attention from anyone beyond its immediate neighbors. Roman tradition associated the great phase of drainage and urban building that transformed Rome into a functioning city with the Etruscan linked kings, and the technical approach fits the broader pattern of Etruscan engineering influence in the period. The Cloaca Maxima, the great drainage channel carrying water away from the low, lying ground between Rome's hills and making the Forum Valley usable as an urban space, was connected in Roman tradition to the Tarquin period. Without effective drainage, the Forum Valley, which became the center of Roman public and commercial life for centuries, would have remained the seasonal marsh it was before that work was done. The Circus Maximus, the venue for chariot racing and public games that became one of the defining institutions of Roman civic life, was established in its original form under the Tarquin kings. The specific form of public spectacle it hosted, organized competitive events conducted before the entire assembled urban population as a shared civic ritual, had recognizable precedence in Etruscan public culture. The Etruscans organized public games, serving the function of reinforcing collective identity and providing a shared experience that cut across the social hierarchies of ordinary life. Rome took that model and eventually scaled it to a size the Etruscan original had never approached. Servius Tullius, the 6th king, is credited in Roman tradition with 2 of the most consequential institutional developments in early Roman history. The census, a systematic enumeration of the Roman population organized by wealth categories, providing the framework for military obligation and political participation, required the kind of administrative capacity that was not native to the small Latin community Rome had been before the period of Etruscan. Connected kings. The reorganization of Roman territory into administrative units called tribes, providing the geographic framework for taxation, military recruitment, and political representation that would structure Roman governance for centuries. Similarly, reflects organizational models consistent with what is known of Etruscan administrative sophistication in the same period. The expulsion of Tarquinius Superbus in 509 BC, which Roman tradition presented as a liberation from tyranny and the founding moment of the Republic, was followed almost immediately by Etruscan military attempts to restore the expelled king. Lars Porsena, ruler of the Etruscan city of Clusium, led an army against Rome in an episode that the Roman sources handle with considerable awkwardness. The most reliable ancient accounts suggest that Porsena may have actually captured Rome, or at least extracted significant concessions, before withdrawing, whether or not Porsena held Rome briefly. The episode illustrates how genuinely bilateral the early relationship between Rome and Etruria was, rather than simply a matter of cultural influence flowing in one direction. The Roman decision to expel the Tarquin kings was, among other things, a decision to assert a specifically Roman identity against the Etruscan cultural dominance that the Tarquin period represented. The republic that followed was designed, in its ideological self, presentation, as a specifically Roman achievement. The Etruscan contribution to Rome's formation was not featured in that self-presentation. It was minimized, and over the centuries of the Republic and the Empire, it was largely forgotten in the institutions responsible for transmitting Roman historical memory. But the physical reality of Rome told a different story. The drainage infrastructure associated with the Tarquin period drew on Etruscan engineering traditions and was associated in Roman tradition itself with Etruscan-linked kings. The religious architecture housing Rome's most important cult was designed and decorated by Etruscan craftsmen. The public entertainment traditions giving Roman civic life much of its character had Etruscan precedents. The administrative institutions organizing Roman governance carried the marks of Etruscan organizational models. Rome inherited and transformed what it inherited was, in ways the Roman tradition consistently preferred not to dwell on, substantially Etruscan in its origins. And what it transformed those inheritances into was something distinctly Roman and genuinely its own. But the starting point for that transformation included a contribution that the subsequent success of Roman civilization has tended to render invisible precisely because it was so thoroughly absorbed. Vulci of Veii went home. What he left behind stayed. And the city he returned to would be destroyed within a century by the civilization that had learned from everything he and people like him had built. In 474 BC, two fleets met in the waters off the coast of Cumae, a Greek colonial city on the northern edge of the Bay of Naples. One fleet came from Syracuse, the most powerful Greek city in the western Mediterranean, led by its ruler Hiero I, who had spent years building Syracuse into a naval force capable of projecting power across the central Mediterranean. The other fleet came from the Etruscan cities of the Tyrrhenian coast, assembled to challenge Greek dominance over the sea lanes that the Etruscans had organized and profited from for the better part of 2 centuries. The engagement was decisive in favor of Syracuse. The defeat was significant enough that Hiero sent a portion of the captured Etruscan military equipment, including bronze helmets, to the sanctuary at Olympia in Greece as a victory dedication. One of those helmets is in the collection of the British Museum in London. It is a simple object in some respects, a piece of military hardware, dented and worn, and showing its age across 2,500 years. On its surface is an inscription in Greek identifying it as spoils taken from the Etruscans at Cumae, dedicated to Zeus by Hiero and the Syracusans. That helmet is one of the most precisely dated and precisely documented artifacts of the entire Etruscan world. It is the physical record of a moment that contributed significantly to the beginning of the Etruscan commercial network's long contraction. Most histories that mention Cumae at all treat it as a minor episode, a naval battle of regional significance worth a footnote in the larger story of classical Mediterranean history. That framing misses what the battle meant and what it set in motion. The Etruscans had been building their commercial presence in the southern part of the Italian peninsula for roughly 2 centuries before Cumae. Etruscan merchants and settlers had established themselves in Campania, the fertile coastal region south of Latium, Capua, which would become one of the most significant cities in Roman Italy, was either founded by Etruscans or developed under substantial Etruscan cultural and commercial influence. Nola, Pompeii, and other Campanian sites show strong Etruscan presence in their archaeological records from the same period. This southern extension of the Etruscan commercial world was connected to the heartland of Etruria proper by both overland routes through Latium and by the sea lanes of the Tyrrhenian coast. The sea routes were faster and could carry larger cargoes, and they were the arteries through which the commercial integration of the Etruscan network across the full length of the western Italian coast was sustained. The Greek colonial cities of Sicily and southern Italy had been watching the development of Etruscan commercial influence in the Tyrrhenian with increasing concern across the 6th century BC. From the Greek perspective, Etruscan presence in the Tyrrhenian was a constraint on Greek ability to expand commercial and naval activity into waters that Greek merchants wanted to access on their own terms. An earlier naval engagement off the coast of Corsica, sometimes called the Battle of Alalia, sometime around 540 BC, had brought Etruscan and Carthaginian forces together in a way that limited Greek expansion into the central Tyrrhenian, though without producing a decisive settlement of the underlying competition. Cumae in 470. 4 BC was the decisive settlement. Naval power in the ancient Mediterranean was not simply a matter of possessing ships. It was a matter of possessing trained personnel, harbour infrastructure, supply networks, accumulated institutional knowledge, and the culture of consistent operational confidence that sustained maritime power across time and distance. Building a fleet capable of contesting the Tyrrhenian required decades of investment in all of those dimensions simultaneously. Losing that fleet in a single engagement meant losing not just the ships, but the human capital, the experienced sailors and officers and navigators. That the ships represented, the Etruscan cities retained the material resources to build new ships. What they could not easily rebuild was the culture of maritime dominance, the institutional confidence of communities that had treated the Tyrrhenian as their operational space for 2 centuries. That the defeat disrupted. The Etruscan presence in Campania began to weaken in the decades after Cumae, alongside other pressures including Greek commercial expansion and Samnite territorial movement. Etruscan material culture becomes less prominent in Campanian sites. The political connections between the Campanian cities and the Etruscan heartland loosen. By the end of the 5th century BC, Samnite peoples, moving down from the Apennine highlands, had taken control of cities like Capua, ending the Etruscan presence in the region. The loss of Campania meant the loss of the southern terminal of the Tyrrhenian commercial routes that had been among the most productive components of the Etruscan commercial network. Commercial networks are not static. They require continuous investment and maintenance to function. When revenues contract, the investment maintaining the network contracts with them, and the network shrinks further. The comparison with Salamis, the great Greek naval victory over the Persian fleet in 480 BC, is worth making carefully and with explicit acknowledgement that the two situations differ in important ways. At Salamis, 6 years before Cumae, a Persian fleet was defeated in a battle that did not immediately end Persian power, but substantially changed the strategic situation in the Aegean in ways that played out across the following decades. Persia never again projected naval power into the Aegean with the same confidence or effectiveness. Something similar can be said of Cumae for the Etruscan position in the Tyrrhenian. The question of who would ultimately set the terms of access to that sea had been answered, and the answer was not the Etruscans. The subsequent contraction in Campania, the weakening of the southern trade routes, the increasing commercial isolation of the Etruscan heartland from the broader Mediterranean network it had helped to organize were among the consequences that followed. Alongside the other pressures of a changing Mediterranean world, Hiero I understood the significance of what he had won. The dedication at Olympia was not only a pious act of thanksgiving, it was a statement broadcast to the Greek-speaking world in the most public venue available, that the Western Mediterranean had been decided in favour of Greek commercial and naval interests. The dented bronze helmet sitting under careful lighting in a London museum is the smallest and most specific physical artifact of one of the largest strategic shifts in the history of the ancient Western Mediterranean. Somewhere beneath it, for a few hours in 474 BC, stood an Etruscan soldier whose world was changing faster than he could know. When the battle ended and the helmet changed hands, so did the sea. And when the sea changed hands, everything the Etruscans had built around their mastery of it began, slowly and without announcement, to come undone. The standard account of the Gallic invasion of Italy in the early 4th century BC is organized around what happened to Rome. The Gauls crossed the Alps. They defeated a Roman army at the Allia River in 390 BC, a defeat so catastrophic in Roman collective memory that the date was marked in the Roman calendar as a day of ill omen for centuries afterward. They advanced to Rome itself, occupied much of the city, and remained for some months before withdrawing. According to the famous account, after the Romans paid a ransom in gold, then Rome rebuilt, reformed its military, and eventually turned the experience into a foundational narrative about Roman resilience. That account is accurate in its broad outline, but it is organized around the wrong center. The Gauls did not arrive in Italy and proceed directly to Rome. They moved through a landscape that Etruscan civilization had been organizing and inhabiting for 2 centuries before they got there. And the communities they encountered first, the Etruscan cities of the Po Valley, did not have a recovery story to tell. For them, what the Gauls represented was not a crisis that was survived and transformed into a foundational narrative. It was a permanent ending. The Etruscan expansion into the Po Valley had been one of the most significant territorial developments in pre-Roman Italian history, starting sometime in the 6th century BC. Etruscan communities established themselves across the broad agricultural plain between the Alps and the Apennines, founding or substantially developing cities that became significant centres of population and commerce. Felsina, on the site of what is now Bologna, was the most important of these northern Etruscan centres. substantial enough to leave a rich archaeological record and significant enough to anchor Etruscan cultural and commercial presence across the Po region for roughly 2 centuries. The northern Etruscan cities were not peripheral extensions of a civilization centered elsewhere. They were integral components of the Etruscan commercial network, connected to the heartland cities of central Etruria through trade routes crossing the Apennine passes and serving as the Italian terminus for overland routes, bringing goods southward from Central Europe and the Alpine corridors. Losing the Po Valley meant losing those connections at precisely the moment when the southern reach of the Etruscan network was already contracting following Cumae. When Celtic peoples began moving southward through the Alpine passes into northern Italy in the early 4th century BC, this is what they encountered. Not empty territory. The cities and communities of a civilization that had been organizing the Po Valley for 2 centuries. The specific sequence of events by which the northern Etruscan cities lost their position to Celtic pressure is not documented in detail in any surviving ancient source. The writers who preserved accounts of the Gallic invasion were primarily interested in the Roman experience of it. What the archaeological record shows is a transition in the material culture of the Po region in the early 4th century BC, with Etruscan artifact types giving way to Celtic ones across site after site in the region, indicating a substantial change through some combination of military pressure, population displacement, and demographic change over a period of years or decades. The end result was unambiguous. The city that had been Felsina became Bononia, the name by which its later inhabitants would call it, and the name that survives in modified form as Bologna today. The Etruscan presence that had defined the Po Valley for 2 centuries was gone. Think about what that meant for the families who had lived in Felsina across generations. They had built the warehouses and the workshops and the cemeteries and the temples that expressed their civilization in permanent materials. They had organized trade routes connecting their city to a wider world. They had commissioned tomb paintings and bronze objects and ceramic goods that embodied the cultural traditions they had inherited and that they expected to transmit to their children. And then the world changed around them in ways they could not have anticipated and could not collectively resist. Because there was no collective Etruscan mechanism for resistance, each city was responsible for itself. And being responsible for yourself, when the forces pressing against you are larger than any single city can answer, is not enough. Rome's recovery from the Gallic sack became a foundational story in Roman self-understanding. The Roman military was reorganized. The city was rebuilt. The political institutions, maintaining continuity through the crisis, were celebrated as proof of the durability of Roman republican governance. Rome turned catastrophe into identity. To Rome, the Gauls became a wound that healed into legend. To northern Etruria, they became the reason no legend could be written. The territory that had been the northern extension of Etruscan civilization became, in the Roman administrative geography that eventually organized the entire Italian peninsula, Cisalpine Gaul, meaning the Gaul on this side of the Alps. That name reflected a political and cultural reality that persisted through subsequent generations. The Etruscan dimension of the Po Valley's history was available only to archaeology, not to living tradition. What the Gallic migrations meant for the broader trajectory of Etruscan history is most clearly visible in cumulative context. The defeat at Cumae in 470 BC had cost the Etruscans their commercial dominance in the Tyrrhenian and their sustained presence in Campania. The Gallic migrations of the early 4th century BC cost them the Po Valley and the northern extension of that same network. The Etruscan heartland of central Etruria was being compressed from both directions simultaneously, losing the commercial depth and the territorial scope that had sustained Etruscan civilization at its most expansive phase. When Rome began its systematic campaign of absorption into Etruscan heartland territory in the later 4th and early 3rd centuries BC, it was not encountering the Etruscan world at its maximum extent or its greatest strategic depth. It was encountering a civilization that had already absorbed 2 significant contractions, and that had faced each of them with the same political structure. One that could not coordinate collective responses to threats affecting all its members simultaneously. In 396 BC, after 10 years of uninterrupted siege, the Etruscan city of Veii fell to a Roman army commanded by Marcus Furius Camillus. 10 years. By any historical standard, that is a long time to maintain a military siege against a single city. The Roman commitment required to sustain that operation, the continuous mobilization of military resources, the logistical challenge of supplying a siege force across a decade, the political will to maintain the effort through setbacks, speaks to something important about what Rome understood the fall of Veii to mean. This was not a raid or an attempt to extract tribute. It was the elimination of an Etruscan city as an independent political entity, pursued with the patience and organizational commitment that only that specific objective could have sustained. Veii had been, before its fall, one of the most significant cities in the Etruscan world. Its position on the southern edge of Etruria put it in direct and continuous contact with Rome, close enough that the 2 cities' interests overlapped on almost every significant question of territorial control, commercial access, and political influence in the region between the Tiber and the Apennines. They had been rivals, competitors, and periodic military enemies for generations before the final siege. The long history of that competition gave the siege of Veii a significance beyond its purely military dimensions. It was the moment when Rome decided that the competition would be resolved not by accommodation or negotiated boundaries, but by elimination. The treatment of Veii after its fall was consistent with that intent. According to the Roman sources, Camillus ordered the relocation of the surviving population, the people who had lived in that city across generations, who had built its temples and painted its tomb chambers and organized its civic life, were removed from the place that had defined their community and resettled in Roman territory, where they would be absorbed over the following generations into the Latin-speaking Roman world. The physical city was stripped of its portable contents, including remarkable terracotta sculptures from its temples. Among them the figure of Apollo, now in the Museum of the Villa Giulia in Rome, one of the finest surviving pieces of Etruscan artistic production. That sculpture was carried to Rome, placed in a Roman religious context, and eventually became part of the Roman artistic heritage, rather than being identified as an Etruscan achievement in Roman memory. The other Etruscan cities observed what happened to Veii and made their own calculations. Those calculations varied because the cities were independent and their geographic positions, their relationships with Rome, and their internal political situations were not identical. Some chose forms of accommodation. Others chose resistance. None chose anything together. Rome used a range of legal arrangements to integrate Italian communities, and one of the most revealing was the status known as civitas sine suffragio, citizenship without the vote. In cases where a community received such a status, it gave the holder the obligations that Roman citizenship carried, including military service and tax payment, Without the political rights that would have allowed the holder to influence decisions made by the Roman institutions they were now obligated to support. It was integration without empowerment. Inclusion in the system without participation in the decisions the system made. For communities receiving such a status, it meant the formal end of independent political existence, accomplished through legal reclassification rather than overt conquest. There was no dramatic surrender ceremony. The transition was achieved through paperwork and legal category, which was in many ways more effective than military defeat, because it was harder to resist and harder to reverse. The physical infrastructure of Roman expansion reinforced the legal mechanisms. The roads Roman engineers built through Etruscan territory were military assets, but simultaneously commercial ones, connecting the communities along their routes to Roman markets and the broader Roman commercial system in ways that made participation in the Roman economic world progressively more rational than alternatives. A merchant in Tarquinia who wanted to reach the most profitable markets would increasingly find that those markets were Roman, that the roads connecting him to them were Roman, and that the language of commerce in those markets was Latin. Roman colonization introduced Latin, speaking populations directly into the landscape of Etruscan territory, establishing communities whose presence created zones of cultural contact and gradual linguistic shift in the territories around them, over generations. The presence of Roman colonists alongside Etruscan communities produced bilingual and then predominantly Latin speaking populations in areas where Etruscan had been the primary language. The children of those communities grew up in a world increasingly organized around Roman institutions and Roman cultural norms. Their children grew up in a world where the Etruscan element was a receding family memory rather than a living social reality. The final explicit military chapter of Etruscan independent political life came with the destruction of Vulcinii in 265 BC. Vulcini, identified by most modern scholars with the site of ancient Orvieto in Umbria, occupied a plateau of volcanic tufa whose near vertical sides provided natural defensive advantages, making it one of the most difficult military targets in the entire Etruscan world. It had maintained a degree of genuine political independence longer than most Etruscan cities. The circumstances of its fall, as described in the Roman sources, are revealing about the internal conditions of the late Etruscan world. According to the Roman account, the traditional aristocracy of Vulcinii had over time granted their freed slaves substantial participation in the civic life of the city, enough that the freed slave population had acquired political influence, competing with the authority of the old, noble families. When the aristocrats found themselves unable to recover their dominant position through their own resources, they appealed to Rome. Rome came to help. The Roman intervention at Vulcinii was not a response to a threat to Roman interests in the ordinary sense. It was a response to an invitation from one faction within a nominally independent city that had decided external Roman power served its interests better than continued internal competition. Rome did not need to organize a siege of the formidable plateau fortress. It needed only to respond to a request from people within the city who were willing to accept Roman intervention on terms that Rome found acceptable. The result was the physical destruction of Vulcinii as it had existed and the relocation of its population to a new settlement at Bolsena, on the lake shore below the ancient plateau, organized within the Roman administrative framework. The plateau of Orvieto, where Vulcinii had stood for centuries, was abandoned. The institutional life of the ancient city was dissolved. This was not genocide. The people of Vulcinii were not killed. They were relocated and reorganized, which is a different thing, though not necessarily a less consequential one when measured against what was lost rather than against what was physically preserved. The persons survived. What did not survive was the institutional framework that had made those persons members of a specific civilization with a specific identity. After Vulcinii, there was no Etruscan city that could credibly claim to be governing itself as an Etruscan political community on Etruscan institutional terms. The Etruscan heartland had been consumed, not by a single campaign or a decisive battle, but by a process extending across roughly a century and a half. Applying legal reclassification, commercial integration, colonial settlement, road building, and selective military pressure in combinations adapted to the specific situation of each city and community it encountered, not in a single battle. In a process, long, patient, comprehensive, and ultimately complete. In 260, 4 BC, according to the Roman sources, the sons of a Roman nobleman named Decimus Junius Brutus Scaever organized what ancient writers describe as the first recorded gladiatorial combat in the city of Rome. This was 1 year after the destruction of Vulcinii had marked the end of meaningful Etruscan political independence. The occasion was their father's funeral. 3 pairs of men fought each other with weapons in the Forum Boarium as part of the funeral ceremonies honoring the deceased. The fighters were not professional entertainers. The combat was, according to the framework within which it was conducted, a ritual act, an offering at the moment of a significant death, a form of sacrifice honoring the deceased by marking his passing with the most serious thing the living could offer. The connection between that ceremony and Etruscan funerary traditions is one of the most discussed and most carefully qualified relationships in ancient Mediterranean studies. Etruscan tomb paintings include scenes of armed combat in funerary contexts. Ancient writers made connections between Etruscan practices and the Roman gladiatorial tradition. Whether those connections represent direct institutional transmission, parallel development from shared cultural roots, or something more complicated, is a question that modern scholarship treats with appropriate caution rather than confident assertion. That is the honest state of our knowledge, and it is worth stating clearly at the outset rather than after building an impression of certainty. What can be said is this: the funerary context of the first recorded Roman gladiatorial combat connects it to exactly the domain, death ritual, and the obligations of the living to the dead, in which Etruscan visual culture had been most elaborately developed. The connection between Etruscan funerary traditions and the Roman gladiatorial institution is suggested by multiple types of evidence and acknowledged by serious scholars, even as the precise mechanisms of transmission remain incompletely understood. That pattern, strongly suggested connection, acknowledged by scholarship, precise mechanism uncertain, describes not only the gladiatorial tradition, but a broader set of relationships between Etruscan practice and Roman institutional life that the Roman historical tradition consistently underplayed, and that modern scholarship has spent roughly 2 centuries working to recover. The toga, the wrapped garment that became the most immediately recognizable symbol of Roman male civic identity, was deeply connected to earlier Etruscan forms of ceremonial dress. The evidence, both in ancient textual sources acknowledging Etruscan precedents and in the archaeological record of Etruscan figures wearing wrapped garments recognizable as precursors of the Roman form, is substantial enough that most modern scholars accept the connection as well founded. even without being able to trace every step in the transmission. The fasces, the bundle of rods bound around an axe that the attendants of Roman magistrates carried as the visible symbol of state authority, appears in Etruscan artistic and archaeological contexts before it appears as a Roman institution. Ancient sources explicitly identify the fasces as part of the ceremonial apparatus that Rome adopted from the Etruscan cities. The institution of the lictors, the attendants who carried the fasces before senior magistrates in Roman public life, was an inheritance from an Etruscan tradition of power display that had organized the visual presentation of authority in the Etruscan cities before Rome had a comparable system. The practice of taking the auspices before significant public acts, consulting the divine will through the observation of bird behavior or the reading of sacrificial entrails before military campaigns. Before elections, before the formal beginning of legislative sessions, was embedded in Roman constitutional practice throughout the Republic and well into the imperial period. The specific framework of that practice drew on Etruscan religious practice in ways that the Romans themselves acknowledged in their technical literature on augural law, even as the popular historical tradition tended to present Roman religious practices as simply Roman. What is most significant about this catalogue is the character of the items in it. The toga and the fasces were not peripheral ornaments of Roman civic life. They were its most immediately legible symbolic vocabulary. The visual markers that made a Roman recognizable as a Roman in the most formal and most public contexts of civic existence, the gladiatorial tradition became one of the central institutions of Roman public culture. The augural tradition was woven into the constitutional fabric of Roman governance at every level. The Etruscans were present. Through these inherited institutions, at the center of Roman public life for the entire duration of the Republic and the early Empire, they were present in the garments that Roman citizens wore in court. They were present in the symbols carried before Roman magistrates on the streets of Roman cities. They were present in the entertainment that Roman crowds watched in amphitheatres built throughout the Roman world. They were present in the ceremonies that structured Roman public religious life. They were present everywhere, and they were acknowledged almost nowhere. The Roman literary tradition dealt with the Etruscan contribution in a specific and consistent way. When Etruscan practices and institutions appeared in Roman contexts, they were generally presented as Roman, without reference to their Etruscan origins. When the Etruscans were discussed explicitly, they appeared primarily as the source of the haruspical tradition, presented as foreign religious specialists whose expertise Rome had wisely adopted, or as the people who had briefly dominated Rome under the Tarquin kings, whose expulsion had made Roman liberty possible. This process did not require deliberate deception at the level of individual actors. Cultural naturalization happens gradually and largely unconsciously, as practices become familiar and their origins recede from active awareness. The Romans who wore togas and carried fasces and consulted haruspices were not, in most cases, consciously concealing an Etruscan origin for those practices. They were doing what people in any culture do with inherited practices, treating them as simply how things are done, without pausing to trace the historical chain that had produced their present form. What the Roman literary tradition did more actively was construct a historical narrative about the Tarquin period that framed the Etruscan presence in Rome primarily in terms of tyranny and liberation. That narrative is accurate in its basic outline, but it is organized in a way that makes the Etruscan contribution primarily legible as the problem that Roman virtue solved, rather than as the cultural and institutional foundation on which Roman achievement was substantially built. Rome inherited and transformed. In transforming, it gradually dissolved the explicit awareness of where the inherited elements came from. The toga did not come labelled with a note of attribution. The fasces did not carry an inscription identifying their Etruscan precedents. The Etruscans built things, and the things they built were absorbed into something that called itself Roman and remembered itself as Roman. And the memory of what had been there before was left to the slow and patient work of scholars working 2,000 years after the fact with bronze objects and painted tombs and the fragmentary inscriptions of a language no living person can fully read. In 8 BC, a man died in Rome whose life, looked at from the right angle, was one of the stranger stories produced by the long absorption of the Etruscan world into the Roman one. His name was Gaius Maecenas. He had been, for roughly 3 decades, one of the most powerful figures in the Roman world. He was the closest advisor to Augustus, the first Roman emperor, and the man who managed the cultural program of the regime that ended the Republic and established the political order governing the Mediterranean world for the next several centuries. He was the patron who had supported Virgil through the composition of the Aeneid, the foundational epic of Roman civilization. He had sustained Horace through the years that produced the Odes, the collection that would become the standard against which Latin lyric poetry measured itself for 2,000 years. He had been, in short, one of the architects of the literary tradition through which Roman civilization understood and presented itself to the world. And he was the heir of an Etruscan family. More precisely, he was the heir of a family that had maintained its claim to descent from the ancient aristocracy of Arretium, one of the great cities of the northern Etruscan heartland. Across however many generations had elapsed between the absorption of Arretium into the Roman system and the birth of the man who would become the most influential cultural figure of the Augustan age, Arretium, which survives today as the Tuscan city of Arezzo, had been a member of the Dodecapoli. Its ruling families had been among the Lucumones of the Etruscan aristocratic tradition by the time Gaius Maecenas was born. Arretium had been a Roman city for generations. Its public life was conducted in Latin. Its citizens were Romans in every formal sense. But the family of Maecenas had preserved, through whatever combination of family tradition and deliberate memory, an awareness of what they had been before Rome arrived and organized the world according to Roman categories. What he made of that inheritance in his own experience is the question the historical record raises without answering. The formal shape of his career is unusual in ways that ancient sources noticed and modern scholars have continued to discuss. Despite his proximity to the center of Roman power across 3 decades of the most consequential political transition in Roman history, despite his influence over the cultural program of the regime, despite his personal friendship with Augustus that was close enough to allow him a degree of candor that few others could risk, Gaius Maecenas never held formal political office. He was not a senator. He did not hold any of the magistracies through which Roman political ambition normally expressed and legitimized itself. He did not follow the sequence of offices defining the career path of the Roman political class. He operated outside the formal institutional structure of Roman public life while exercising influence within it that exceeded that of most people who had climbed every available rung of the formal ladder. The ancient sources offer several explanations for this. Some suggest simple temperament, that he was a man of pleasure and aesthetic refinement who found the obligations of formal office incompatible with the way he preferred to live. Some suggest health problems that made sustained formal responsibilities impractical. Some suggest political calculation, that informal influence at the center of power was more durable and more comfortable than formal position that could be lost in a political reversal. And some ancient writers, in passages too brief and too unexplained to serve as firm evidence, hint that something connected to his sense of identity shaped his relationship to Roman formal institutions. We cannot know which explanation is correct, or whether the truth involved some combination of several of them in proportions that no surviving source allows us to establish. What we can observe is the pattern of choices and the kind of life those choices produced. He gathered around him the most significant literary talent of his generation and provided the sustained material support that allowed that talent to produce work of enduring consequence. The poems his patronage made possible became the literary inheritance of Western civilization in ways that neither the poets nor their patron could have anticipated. The Aeneid gave Rome its founding myth in the form all subsequent generations would inherit. The Odes established the formal and emotional parameters of Latin lyric in ways that echoed through every European literary tradition, drawing on the classical inheritance. And Gaius Maecenus funded this project of Roman cultural self. Definition as the heir of the civilization that Rome had replaced. The Etruscan aristocrat as the architect of the literary program most fully articulating what Rome understood itself to be is one of the more complicated ironies that history produces when you look at it from the right angle long enough. He was not the last Etruscan in any literal sense. The Etruscan language was probably still being spoken in some communities during his lifetime. And the process by which the Etruscan population became fully Roman in itself. Understanding extended well beyond his death. What he was, in a more qualified and defensible sense, was the last traceable individual in the Roman historical record who represented, in his family identity, and possibly in some dimension of his self, understanding the specifically Etruscan aristocratic tradition that Rome had absorbed. After him, that thread disappears into the fabric of Roman history. The Etruscan contribution continues in the institutions and the practices and the literary culture that the civilization absorbing Etruria built on Etruscan foundations, but the human face that contribution wore in the person of Gaius Maecenus, the specific and nameable individual whose family had maintained across generations the memory of what they had been before Rome decided what everything would be. That face is gone after 8 BC and is not replaced by anything the surviving sources allow us to identify. He left his gardens and his estate to Augustus. He left no children who carried his name or his identity forward. Whatever he had been, in the fullness of his private identity that no historical source allows us to access, died with him in 8 BC in a Rome that he had helped to make more fully Roman than it had been when he arrived. Picture a young English nobleman in 1790 holding a candle at the entrance to a tomb chamber that has just been opened for the first time in 2,000 years. He has come to Italy on the grand tour. The prestige educational journey considered essential preparation for any young man of means who hoped to be taken seriously as a person of cultivation and taste. He came for Rome, for the ruins of the Forum, for the Colosseum, for the overwhelming physical insistence of a civilization that had organized the known world. He did not come for this. But someone has broken through into a chamber cut from the volcanic tufa of the hills north of Rome. And what the candle reveals in the darkness stops him completely. On the walls, painted in colours that have not seen light in 2 millennia, people are feasting, musicians are playing, dancers are moving with an energy that the darkness has not extinguished. The colours are red and yellow and black against a pale plaster ground. And they are vivid in a way that seems impossible for something this old. He is looking at the Etruscans, and he does not yet know what he is seeing. That encounter, repeated in various forms across the late 1700s and through the 1800s, as tomb after tomb was opened across Tuscany and the territory north of Rome, began the slow process by which the Etruscans re-entered the consciousness of the modern world. What came up from the ground was extraordinary. Painted ceramic vessels of a technical quality rivaling the finest pottery produced anywhere in the ancient Mediterranean world. Gold jewellery worked with techniques that European goldsmiths of the period found difficult to understand and impossible to replicate. Bronze objects decorated with a precision speaking of long, accumulated craft knowledge. The initial response was commercial rather than scholarly. Etruscan tombs contained objects with market value in a European collecting culture that prized beautiful things from antiquity. And the people organising the early excavations understood that market better than they understood what they were digging up. The methods of early Etruscan excavation were what would now be recognised as destructive, focused on retrieving portable objects and largely indifferent to the contextual information that careful documentation would have preserved. Systematic scholarly investigation developed across the 19th century. The necropolis of Cerveteri was mapped and documented in ways giving researchers their first real sense of scale. The burial ground, now known as the Banditacha necropolis, covered roughly 500 hectares and contained thousands of tombs arranged along streets and open spaces, giving the complex the structural logic of a city. The investment that necropolis represented, the labour of carving thousands of burial chambers from volcanic rock, the skill of the craftsmen furnishing and decorating them, spoke of a civilization taking its obligations to the dead with a seriousness matching any culture in the ancient world. Tarquinia's painted tombs, systematically studied from the mid-19th century onward, confirmed what those early candle-lit encounters had suggested. These were not primitive people decorating their graves with crude symbols. These were sophisticated artists depicting a sophisticated social world. Aristocratic men and women eating and drinking and playing music and dancing, rendered with an attention to the specific pleasures of specific moments that reached across 500 years without losing its emotional charge. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Etruscans had acquired a reputation among European intellectuals as a civilizational alternative to Rome. Where Roman civilization was associated with law, order, discipline, and the subordination of individual pleasure to collective purpose, the Etruscans were associated with sensuality, artistic refinement, and a relationship with the body and with death that seemed less anxious than anything the Roman or the Christian traditions following it had produced. This reputation was grounded in real evidence, but also substantially shaped by what each era of rediscoverers needed the Etruscans to be. No one expressed this reading more beautifully, or with more acknowledged romanticism, than David Herbert Lawrence, the British novelist who visited Etruscan sites in Italy in 1927, while dying of tuberculosis, and wrote about the experience in a book called Etruscan Places, published after his death in 1930. 2. Lawrence was honest about what he was doing. He acknowledged that he could not fully know what the Etruscans had actually been, that the tomb paintings showed him surfaces rather than depths. His Etruscans were partly real and partly invented, a creation of his imagination working on the raw material of their art. Shaped by his own situation as a dying man looking at images of a civilization that seemed to have found a better relationship with the fact of death than the one his own tradition had given him. But the questions Lawrence kept returning to were genuine ones. Why did the civilization that learned so much from the Etruscans feel the need to rewrite the history of what it had learned? What was lost in that process that the Etruscan world had possessed and the Roman world did not transmit? The archaeology of the Etruscan world has continued to develop in ways adding substantially to what Lawrence had access to. Ground. Penetrating radar surveys at sites including Cerveteri and Tarquinia have revealed substantial unexcavated structures beneath the surface, indicating that the known archaeological record remains meaningfully incomplete. The ancient DNA analysis, published in 2020, resolved questions about Etruscan origins that 2.5 millennia of literary debate had failed to settle. Ongoing linguistic analysis has refined understanding of Etruscan grammatical structures, even as the language's fundamental isolation remains unchanged. Each generation of researchers has found in the Etruscan evidence something real and also, inevitably, a partial reflection of the questions that generation was equipped to ask. The Grand Tour collectors found beautiful objects. The 19th century systematizers found a civilization worth classifying. Lawrence found a civilizational alternative. The molecular biologists and remote sensing technologists of the 21st century found data that could answer questions their predecessors could not yet formulate. What has remained constant across all those generations of changing questions is the quality that makes the Etruscans worth sustained attention. They built something genuinely remarkable in a time and place where building it was difficult. They built it with a lightness and a pleasure in existence that their tomb paintings still communicate to anyone who stands in front of them. And they built it well enough that the civilization absorbing them could not avoid being shaped by it. Even as that civilization preferred not to look too carefully at the source of what it had received. There is no final Etruscan, no individual whose death we can point to and say with confidence, "Here, at this moment, the Etruscan civilization ended." No last speaker of the language recorded anywhere with a note about what was being lost. No final gathering at the Fanum Voltumnae with someone writing down that this was the last time the cities of Etruria would come together as a recognizable civilization. Civilizations do not end that way. They thin. They become, without announcement and without any single moment that everyone present recognizes as decisive, something else. And the people living through that transformation rarely experience it as a loss, because from inside any given life, the transformation is invisible. It looks like ordinary time. The Etruscan language was probably still being spoken as a living tongue in some communities into the 1st century of the Common Era, roughly 100 years after Rome had completed the formal political absorption of Etruscan territory. The latest Etruscan inscriptions that can be dated with reasonable confidence come from the 1st century BC. Languages do not have death certificates. They stop being transmitted to children. In some households, at some point, and then at some later point, the last person who grew up speaking them as a native language dies. And after that, the language exists only in the inscriptions made when it was alive. Etruscan went that way, without announcement, without anyone writing down what was ending as it ended. The physical landscape changed more slowly than the language. The cities that had been Etruscan continued to exist as Roman cities. Their temples were converted or rebuilt according to Roman architectural forms. Their streets were repaved. The people living in them were, by the late 1st century BC, functionally Roman in their public identities, speaking Latin in the contexts where language choice is visible and recorded, worshipping through Roman religious forms, transmitting Roman names to their children. But underneath the Roman surface, things persisted. The agricultural knowledge, specific to the volcanic landscape of Etruria, the accumulated understanding of how to farm that particular ground, did not evaporate because Rome arrived. It was absorbed into the practice of people who continued farming the same land under a different political organization. The craft traditions of the Etruscan workshops continued under Roman patronage, producing work, increasingly Roman in its subject matter, while remaining rooted in technical traditions. Etruscan in their origins, Roman elites continued to rely on Etruscan, trained haruspices for matters of public significance, because the system served a real function that nothing in the Roman institutional tradition had developed to replace. The transformation was total but not instantaneous. It happened across generations, each one somewhat less Etruscan and somewhat more Roman in itself. Understanding, until the people who were, in some cultural dimensions, the descendants of the Etruscans, no longer experienced themselves as Etruscan at all. The identity dissolved, gradually and without drama, in the way that identities dissolve, when the institutional frameworks sustaining them are replaced by frameworks organized around a different identity and a different story about the past. There is a word that survived through all of this: Tuscany. The region of modern Italy, occupying roughly the same territory as ancient Etruria, takes its name from Tusci, which was the Latin word that Roman administration used for the Etruscans. Rome renamed them, as it renamed most of what it absorbed. But the name it gave stuck in the landscape in a way that 2,000 years of subsequent transformation have not displaced. The wine country and the hill towns and the Cyprus-lined roads of the region that millions of people visit every year occupy land that still carries, in the word used to describe it, the memory of the people who organized and inhabited it before Rome had a name that anyone outside the immediate neighborhood of the Tiber Bend would have recognized. There is an alphabet that survived. The writing system that the Etruscans adapted from the Greeks and used to record their language, their religious traditions, and their commercial transactions across 3 centuries of active Etruscan civilization did not die with the Etruscan language. The Romans adapted it again, producing, from the Etruscan version of the Greek alphabet, the Latin alphabet that became the writing system of the Roman Empire, and, through the Roman Empire of the Catholic Church, and through the Catholic Church and the European civilization that followed, of most of the modern world. The alphabet that your eyes are moving across at this moment passed through Etruscan hands on its way from the Phoenician original to the Latin form that eventually produced every letter on this page. There is a landscape that survived. The volcanic hills of Etruria are still there. Their geology, unchanged by the political transformations reorganizing human life on their surface across 25 centuries. The same tufa that Etruscan craftsmen carved into tomb chambers and city walls still underlies the landscape of Tuscany and northern Lazio. The agricultural potential that made Etruscan farmers productive enough to support the specialized populations of their cities still produces wine and olive oil and grain from the same ground, worked now by people who carry, as one strand among many in a deep and complex ancestry, the biological inheritance of the populations that lived on this land through the Etruscan period and long before it. There are the tombs. The painted chambers of Tarquinia are still there. The couples at their feasts, the dancers caught in motion by painters trying to fix something alive before it became merely past, the musicians playing for the dead, the blue, skinned figures waiting at the margins of the later paintings. They have been underground for 500 years, sealed in chambers that the tufa preserved against light and air, and they are still communicating. After all that time, after all that loss, after the language and the cities and the religious system and the political institutions have been gone for 2,000 years, the paintings in the sealed chambers of Tarquinia are still communicating something about what it meant to be alive in a specific time and place that no longer exists. The Etruscans could not stop what happened to them. The forces absorbing them were too large, too patient, too comprehensively organized to be resisted indefinitely by a civilization that had chosen to build its identity around the sovereignty of individual cities rather than the power of collective institutions. That choice was genuine, and it reflected genuine values. But it meant that when the encounter with Rome came, the Etruscan world had no mechanism for marshalling the collective response. The situation required, and what individual cities could do, impressive as it often was not enough. But they left the tombs. They left the language in the inscriptions. Even if no living person can hear all of it anymore, they left the alphabet, which has travelled further and lasted longer and shaped more of human communication than anything else they made. They left their name on the land, embedded in a word that everyone who visits that part of Italy uses without knowing what they are saying when they say it. They lost the state. They lost the language. They lost the gods, but not the name. Tuscany is still Tuscany. That name survived the language that gave it meaning, the civilization that built the landscape it describes, the religion organizing the lives of the people who first called themselves by something close to that name. It survived Rome and the medieval period, and every subsequent reorganization of the political and cultural landscape of the Italian peninsula. The name survived everything, and in a name. Sometimes, there is enough of what was lost to make the loss worth knowing about.